So yeah, he was saying, I went for a year in 2007, ended up staying for 7. And a lot of what attracted me to China in the first place was how fast things were changing, how rapidly the economy was growing, and all the really interesting, weird kind of side effects coming along with that. And I think anytime when you have a society changing that fast, it's the young people that most reflect that, and how they're being shaped by all the new things happening, and how the lack of baggage of history that they have compared to their parents' generation. So I really wanted to delve into a lot of different diverse young people from across the country, from a lot of different demographics, and challenge some of the narratives that I had seen emerging in the media. I think the young generation in China, so when I talk about millennials, I'm talking about people born between about the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s. And I think they get a lot of stereotypes both at home and abroad. At home, a popular stereotype is that they are little emperors. They were brought up by parents who lived through very difficult times, some of them through the Mao era, some through the 80s, which were still, although China was opening up, still a very hard time for most of the country. And yet they were brought up with this incredible economic growth, all these new opportunities, so there's a feeling that they just don't have any idea of what real hardship is, that they're spoiled little brats, which I think is the same in any country about an older generation, about the younger, but China just feels very acute. And the stereotype from abroad that I noticed in a lot of media reports, particularly when there were anniversaries of the Tiananmen protests, a lot of journalists kind of looked back and said, why haven't young people in China embarked on this idealistic political movement like people did in '89? And the answer, it seemed, that most journalists came back with was, on one hand, they've become very nationalistic. The government has really co-opted them through anti-foreign education, shifted their attention towards foreign enemies rather than domestic leaders. And on the other hand, the growing economy has made them very materialistic, very focused on money, on what they can hold in their hand rather than lofty political ambitions. And when you look back at history, at how things have unfolded since Tiananmen, I think that narrative did have a lot of currency, and still to some degree does. Pretty quickly after Tiananmen, throughout the 80s, China, although it was becoming capitalist, still relied on socialist ideology as the government's source of legitimacy, pushed class struggle, capitalism is evil, and yet capitalism is everywhere around people, so the reality really contradicted what they were being taught. Tiananmen kind of showed that was bunk. So within 2 years, China launched what was called the Patriotic Education Campaign, which really emphasized China's illustrious 5,000-year history, how it was this great world power, but then during the century of humiliation from the Opium War in 1840 through the end of World War II, the especially brutal Japanese invasion, foreign aggressors brought China to its knees, and it wasn't until the Communist Party liberated the country, started to rise back up to its feet. So that education really shifted. But then, of course, the economy, I think he had an even more profound effect, where the government really started to privatize in earnest in the early 1990s. 2001 joined the WTO, integrated China into the world economy, and then it just took off. So people were becoming more materialistic. But I want to tell, to start this off, a story of two very different Chinas and how a lot of things have changed between generations. So both of these stories happen in the same city, in Shenzhen, the very south of China, which is kind of where China's economic boom began. It was the first kind of workshop of the world, where all the factories were. So I kind of tried to compare the older generation. I found some studies that were done there, some interviews with workers, and one story really kind of stuck out. In 1993, there was this doll factory called the Zhili Doll Factory, and at that time, things were very Dickensian in factories, And the owner of this factory, he was worried about his workers stealing the goods that they were producing. So he barricaded all the exits, barred up the windows. And then one day a fire broke out, and 87 young women, all women from rural areas, were killed. And after this happened, they were going through the rubble and they found this box of letters between workers at the factory, other workers in the region and their families. And a scholar sat down and analyzed these. And it really gave kind of a bleak picture of factory life at the time. People worried about not getting enough to eat. At the time, there was a law that if you were caught on the street without a local ID, you could be arrested, given a crippling fine. So bosses kind of confiscated people's IDs. So they really had the workers under their thumbs. And workers were really there because it gave them a chance to break away from the subsistence existence on farms. So they really kept their heads down and really didn't think about leaving factories unless things were just desperate. They weren't getting paid at all. But maybe the most striking thing about the letters is what they did not contain. Not a single one talked about a worker complaining to a boss. Not a single one talked about complaining to authorities if something was wrong. So yeah, people really kept their heads down in that era. But they were, in most cases, happy to have that. They were very easily replaced. They knew if they raised a fuss, they could be replaced by the limitless supply of new workers coming in. Authorities could easily suppress them. They couldn't organize something if they wanted to. So that's 1993. Fast forward 17 years, 2010. So that year, a big story that you might have heard of happened in Shenzhen at the factory Foxconn. Anybody remember? Happened that year. So this is the factory that makes Apple's iPods, iPads. In that year, there were 14 suicides among workers at that factory. So it got a lot of international attention. And this young reporter that I interviewed for my book, he was a 20-year-old intern reporter at the time for this pretty liberal newspaper. And he secretly got a job in the factory to report on conditions. He was kind of expecting this hellscape Dickensian wasteland, but he got in and he was immediately shocked at how nice it was. He said there were like a gym, a swimming pool. He was a Tsinghua University student at the time. He said the dorms are actually nicer than my Tsinghua dormitory. And then when you look back at the statistics, Foxconn had 1 million employees at the time. So actually 14 suicides was a rate that was lower than the overall suicide rate in China. So that story was kind of backwards, actually. So he got in there and he said, that's not really the story here, but there is an even more compelling story that he thought. And that when he talked to workers, they had these amazing ambitions. And when I talked to workers there too, I found the same thing. Whereas a generation ago, people came for a few years saving up money and then by and large went back home to start a family. A lot of workers wanted to stay there and use that as a rung on the ladder. One guy I talked to wanted to open his own factory eventually. Another guy I talked to said he wanted to learn English, emigrate abroad, and teach Chinese to foreigners in another country. So much loftier goals than the previous generation. But the way this reporter put it, he said they often dream, but also repeatedly tear apart their dreams, like a miserable painter who keeps tearing up their drafts. If we keep working like this, we might as well quit dreaming for the rest of our lives. And the way that he saw it was they have these huge ambitions, but the path from point A to point B, a lot of people couldn't figure it out. Social mobility was really kind of hampered and expectations were getting way ahead of reality. And this reporter said if our society, our government can't deal with that, it will incur some very big problems. And in fact, that's what we already see happening. You see all kinds of factory protests, riots, strikes, things that were unheard of even 10 years ago. And you look at this chart, there's a group that's been tracking strikes in China month by month, so each bar is a month. Look at January 2011, they tracked 8 worker strikes in all of China. By January 2016, 5 years later, they counted 503. Now there are a lot of reasons for this. The economy is slowing, which puts pressure on factories, which is creating conflicts. But I don't think you can underestimate the role of the changing consciousness in young workers. Most factory workers in China are under 30, so it's the young people really driving these things. And I heard this from people I was talking to being much more willing to stand up and fight for their rights and push for more. Like one young guy I talked to said, He quit his job at a factory because it was hot and his boss refused to install an air conditioner. And his parents had been migrant workers and they were just mortified that he had left. And they paid him on time and they paid him pretty well, but that was not good enough. And they were mortified that he did it, but he was confident enough that he did. And you just see this left and right, people demanding more, and this clash again, a lot of the expectations getting ahead of reality. And going back to where this shifting consciousness is coming from, like I was saying, after Tiananmen, one of the things the government really tried to do was open the economy more, give people more economic freedom and more personal freedom, because these had been some of the grievances that protesters had had. So the early 1990s, the economy really started to tick upwards. In 2001, China joined the WTO, started integrating into the international economy. Growth just exploded from there. So if you were somebody that was born around here, you were growing up, and then all of a sudden things started getting a lot better, then this sort of grand bargain of material growth, economic growth in exchange for political acquiescence, that worked pretty well. People had the memories of how hard things were, how hard it was to have economic security, and they kept their heads down and didn't raise a fuss. Now you have people born in the late 80s and 1990s especially who were born amid this uptick. Now you have people especially who came of age during this time that are really starting to take economic basic security for granted, and that's not enough anymore for a lot of young people. The other big implication of this, China used to have what were called Danwei work units, which was like the lowest level of the government bureaucracy. So when you were ready to go to work, the state assigned you a job, and this work unit controlled everything. They controlled what money you were given, what benefits you were given, your housing. You had to get permission to get married, to travel somewhere. They even monitored women's menstruation cycles, make sure they weren't getting pregnant when they weren't supposed to in a lot of cases. So Big Brother was really in your face in those years. But then as the private economy took off, people weren't as reliant on the state, that system really collapsed. And Big Brother didn't completely leave, but he kind of went around the corner where most people don't notice him. So young people have grown up with unprecedented personal freedom, and that respect for authority, that respect for Big Brother is really kind of breaking down, and people are less afraid of doing things like protesting. The other big implication that's come with this is the spread of information. So in the year 2000, almost nobody was online. Now more than half of China is on the internet. This is even more acute among young people. About 80% of teenagers are online. So a couple implications of this. People are now seeing all kinds of information that counters the party line that's put in media, in education system, getting all sorts of different views. But I think more importantly though, it's just letting people sort of discover themselves and making people more individualistic. So for example, if you start feeling you're gay in China, 15 years ago you might have thought you had a mental illness, which in fact it was classified as such until 2001. But now you can go online, see I'm not the only one, there are lots of people, my lifestyle is normal. And no matter what it is you're into, you can see this. So if you extrapolate that out into Chinese society, it's just become this vibrant place of individualism. You have these youth cultures, countercultures. China has Hell's Angels, Goths, travelers trying to figure out what it all means, tough guy football players, any kind of culture you can think of in the United States or counterculture, China has an equivalent. Hipsters, hippies, anything you can think of. I think it really speaks to this, people being unafraid of doing what was taboo in the very recent past, and exploring religious beliefs. I think this is one very interesting aspect I'll get back to in a minute. But the other implication of this is now you have this enormous gap between the older generation and the younger generation. Older people see this and are just mortified, like I said. And in America we use terms like the greatest generation, baby boomers, millennials. These are like 20-year, 25-year periods. China's generations are much narrower. They say like post-80s, post-90s. Even now people are even narrower 5-year increments, post-85s, post-90, post-95s. Because the change has been so rapid, that somebody born in 95 might notice stark differences in themselves, their attitudes, someone born in 1990. If they compare themselves to their parents, my God, it's a completely different world that they grew up in. And this is one stat that I think is pretty telling. 74% of Chinese age 18 to 35 say, I feel I have more in common with young people in other countries than I do older people in my own country. So really, the gaps are big. Like I was saying, another thing that's come with this, people less concerned with monetary, material benefits, is now that there is this basic economic security, young people are wanting more of a sense of meaning in life, more of a spiritual satisfaction. I mean, you see this anywhere in the world. It's kind of the hierarchy of needs. Once you have your basic needs met, you start getting more abstract desires. So one way I think it's interesting to measure this is in religious believers. China is very unique in that its religious population is very young, whereas in the United States, most developed countries, it's the older people who are more religious. China is the opposite. Young people make up the vast bulk. And I really think this speaks to how young people are really starting to search for some kind of meaning beyond material gains. Religion's an easy way of measuring this, but you also see this in things like volunteerism, traveling. There's a lot of navel gazers now in China trying to figure out what it all means, and pushing more social issues, activism, especially, which I'll talk about next. But looking at the workforce, 63% of young Chinese now say a lot of people my age are seeking jobs that give back to society. And I don't know if it's a little small here, but each of these bars, the dark bars, people born after 1980, 80 to 84, 85 to 90, after 1990. So they did this survey asking, what are you looking for in a job, in the work that you do? People saying improve the quality of life and getting good pay, very steadily decreasing the younger you get. Whereas saying I enjoy the work or to fulfill my aspirations, steadily getting higher. So again, speaks to the less and less concern for economic security. But then one of the major things, implications of this, 78% of Chinese under 35 say my generation isn't afraid to take up a cause and do it ourselves if higher powers fail to act quickly and adequately. So I already talked about this a little bit with the factory workers, but you see this all over the place now. So another one, environmental protests. In 2007 in Xiamen, there was this big protest that broke out over a chemical factory that was planning to come to town. And a lot of people were worried about this, messages spread, and at the end over 10,000 people took to the streets, and it was mostly led by like high school and college students willing to go out in mass to protest. I mean, environmental issues do have an impact on their lives, but it's not like something that had a clear and present impact on their day-to-day livelihood. So this was really a turning point. You had never seen an urban environmental protest like this in China. Since then, you've seen a lot of different cities have had these protests with tens of thousands of people, mostly youth-led. You've also seen this with social activism. So these are some people I talk about in my book, some feminist activists and LGBT activists. So this woman, you might have heard of her. About a year ago, she was arrested with 5 other young women for planning to hand out leaflets against sexual harassment. So she led all these pretty innocuous demonstrations pushing for feminist causes, like getting a higher ratio of women's toilets in public to men's. Pretty basic things, but the government did not like the fact of how organized they were. They had people all over the country joining in, and they were an independent force pushing for social rights. And they have suffered badly for it. I talked to her for the book before this all happened, but even then she was harassed pretty badly, interrogated by police. They tried to go to her parents, and then eventually she was jailed for over a month. And I kind of asked her, like, why do you do this? Do you think you're having much of an impact? And she says, well, if you fight for something, you shouldn't do it because you think it can be achieved. You should fight for it because it's right. And I heard this attitude from a lot of young activists of really having high ideals that you're willing to suffer for personally, even if it doesn't benefit them individually. But they actually made some gains. There were all kinds of laws passed around the same time they were doing this, that, like against domestic abuse, about public toilets, so they had a real impact on what they were doing. And then getting a little bit more extreme political activists. This was a college student who started a campaign about an imprisoned human rights lawyer, and she made this picture supporting him, got a bunch of her friends to do the same thing, uploaded pictures online with their faces shown, which I thought was pretty remarkable, pretty brave of them. And then this guy I talked to last year on the anniversary of the Tiananmen movement. He wrote this really biting, critical letter of the Communist Party, basically calling it fascist, telling it to reassess Tiananmen. Spread this letter, a bunch of friends signed it, then it kind of spread and ended up a couple thousand people, most of them in mainland China, signed on to this. And I asked them both, like, are you crazy, in so many words, because this is very, very sensitive. A lot of people go to jail for this kind of thing. And both of them said, like, yeah, it would have been really crazy 5-10 years ago. People would have avoided me for doing this. People would not want to get tied up with me, but now it's easy to find people around me. They were not just going online and finding other radicals on the other side of the country. They were just talking to their friends, and a lot of people went along with it, which I thought, again, speaks to how quickly people are willing to touch on the most sensitive of political issues. And then I think the most significant thing was in 2013 when there was this newspaper that wrote a really critical, well, not really, but a mildly critical editorial calling on the government to respect constitutionalism. And government censors went in and tooled it to a really cheesy puff piece. And reporters went on strike, word leaked out, and all of a sudden thousands and thousands of people across the country were voicing support. Mostly college students, mostly young people holding up signs like saying, "Let's go Southern Weekend," the name of the paper, again, with their faces shown. Even more significantly, people showed up outside the newspaper's offices, a couple hundred of them, to show support in person. And I think this picture here speaks volumes. There were police at this protest going around taking pictures of people, kind of trying to intimidate protesters. You can see from this young woman about how well that worked. And this, I think, was a turning point too, because environmental protests, okay, that does have some tangible impact, but they're talking about freedom of press, freedom of speech, getting a bit loftier in their demands. So this is one side of what I try to portray about how young people are really becoming more outspoken with much more ambition, much higher expectations. The other side of the story is that the reality in China is becoming a lot tougher in a lot of ways for young people. So I think there's a lot of things pushing back against this little emperor stereotype that this generation spoiled and doesn't know what real hardship is. So I'm going to go through some of these issues. If anyone wants to revisit them in the Q&A, we can. I'll go through somewhat quickly. The first is the glut of white-collar wannabe college graduates entering the workforce. Almost every year now you see the same story around June, where you have about 250,000 more college graduates entering the job market than last year. So the latest number was about 7.5 million new college graduates entering the job market in 1 year. That was about 250,000 more than the previous year. And then the other side of that story is 10, 15, 20% fewer jobs waiting for them. So the economy is not able to accommodate all these new college graduates. So now you have a lot of people who were taught pass the college entrance exam, which is just brutal in China, but work hard, get through this, get into a good school, you'll have a bright, stable future. Now people are graduating and that's not necessarily there. So there's a lot of feeling of disillusionment, I think, with a lot of college graduates that really suffer. And now you have this interesting phenomena in a lot of big cities where college graduates are living in like these dank cellars, living miles and miles outside of town with migrant workers because they're trying to find a job, and white-collar pay, because of this glut of graduates, is going down, and you have people living in the same conditions as migrant workers. Migrant pay actually surpassed the starting income for college graduates a few years ago. So very disillusioning. Making matters worse, the wealth inequality in China. So I don't want to get too wonky, but if you're familiar with the Gini coefficient, basically what this means is 0 means everybody has the same wealth, perfect equality. 1 means one person controls all wealth. And it's generally considered if you get to point 4 on this scale as a society, that's a danger level. You risk social unrest. The United States, infamously bad wealth inequality, as you're hearing about in the election campaign right now, is represented by this blue line. China's wealth inequality, according to official figures, peaked a couple years ago, a bit higher than America's, but now is declining. But more independent and I think reliable figures put that at about 0.61 and rising, which would make China one of the most unequal societies in the world. And of course, when this happens, it's anything economically challenging happens, it's the young people who are entering the workforce that are most acutely impacted by it. And I talk to young people again and again going into the labor market. They told me the same story again and again. If you don't have connections, if you don't have a good family background, it's becoming harder and harder. Whereas at the beginning of reforms through the 90s, 2000s, there was so much low-hanging fruit in the economy to where if you were smart, capable, you could grab some of that fruit, start a business, do something, be successful. But now all that fruit's been taken and hoarded by an increasingly small circle of elites. So I heard that even the most menial jobs, especially among rural migrants, that if they don't have local connections, it's very hard to advance. And survey data has borne this out as well. A survey from a couple years ago found that 80.4% in China believe that young people who achieve career success do so because of their family connections. Only 10% thought that hard work, creativity, academic achievements beat having a well-connected father. This was a cartoon that went viral a couple of years ago, I think really speaks to this. Whereas you have the guy on top with well-connected parents propelling him ahead on his job search. Then you have the college graduate with poor rural parents. Not only are they not getting any support, but they are being expected to support their aging parents, really dragging him behind. So even if you're smarter, the well-connected is going to do that. And you see all this, like China, the terms fuerdai, guanerdai, like second generation rich, second generation officials have become very reviled, and you see all these stories spread of ostentatious youth showing off their wealth, really creating sour feelings. And some of the people this hits hardest are rural people. So China still has this hukou residency system, which classifies you as urban or rural. So this basically decides wherever your hukou residence permit is, that's what decides what kind of benefits you get, where your kids can go to school. So people in cities where all these services are much better have a huge advantage. And over the past 15 years, everybody's made more money, but urban people have experienced growth much faster. 380% growth for urban as compared to 318% growth. The big challenge of this now, though, is that 23% of Chinese millennials, so born between 1980 and 2000, were born in cities. So only about a quarter of this generation age cohort was actually born in cities. But now 59% of them live there. So you have this huge gap of about a quarter of this age cohort that were born in rural areas, now migrating to cities, and they're seeing firsthand all of the things that they are denied compared to their urban counterparts. Now, China's development model for a long time focused on cities, having cities grow faster, because from a kind of cynical political standpoint, this is where the political risk is. It's people in cities that can gather and start collective action. People in the countryside are much more segregated, much easier to control. So the priority is to make cities happy. But now you have rural people living in the cities, so this kind of bargain is being stretched when you see rural people seeing what they're missing out on. This gets even more challenging if you're a woman. Now, you would expect in most societies as you develop, women gain in power. China, it's not necessarily the case. Women are making more money in absolute terms, like everybody overall, but relative to men, women are falling behind. So in 1990, urban women made 78% of what men did. By 2010, they'd fallen to 67%. Rural women got an even rawer deal, 79% to 56% by 2010. So you have these increasing gaps in money, and money is power. So on one end, you have increasingly wealthy and powerful urban men on one side, increasingly vulnerable rural women on the other side. And this is having a lot of very negative implications for the status of a woman. And you see a lot of traditional patriarchal attitudes kind of reemerging. And again, it's young people that experience this most, entering the workforce and confronting all kinds of sexism, exploitation, which I cover in a little bit more detail in the book. But again, a group that is facing a lot of challenges, rural women especially. Another huge challenge disproportionately facing young people is the aging population. So because of the one-child policy, there is an artificial population bottleneck where you have a rapidly aging population and a rapid decline in young workers to support them. So this is one of the things that's really affecting China's slowdown in growth, whereas before you had a limitless supply of cheap labor. Now that labor is drying up, wages are rising, and at an individual level, this is really challenging because you have a lot of only children being expected to support 2 parents and 4 grandparents in many cases, the 4-2-1 problem, as it's often called. And this is putting a huge burden on a lot of people. And I talked earlier about how young people are becoming more ambitious, more individualistic. And one stat that I think also bears this out, now about 15% of Chinese adults are single. That's up from about 6% in 1990. So I think this is one kind of indicator that young people are increasingly rejecting the traditional path. I think in China, the older generation, by and large, still wants their kids to do what they did. Work hard, get as good a job as you can, get a good stable salary, get married very quickly, and have a baby really quickly. And now you can have 2 babies, even better. And because for that generation, a baby was a security policy, because that was kind of the tacit family bargain. We'll raise you, take care of you completely until you're old enough, and then you support us when we're retired. And a lot of young people now don't want that career path. They don't want the job that pays the most money. They want something that fulfills them more. Don't necessarily want to rush into marriage. Maybe don't want to get married at all. Maybe don't want to have a baby at all. And when Chinese tell their parents that is a huge source of conflict. I mean, I have gotten pressure from my parents in America wanting me to get married. Of course, that's natural anywhere. But I think in China, this is really, really acute and becoming a more kind of serious thing. I put a kind of basis of comparison. In the US, the comparable number is 50% of adults are single. So China's not quite at the same level of individualism and comfort breaking the taboo, but I think it's quite quickly getting there. So that's a big thing, this aging population that's going to continue to put pressure on young people. One more very unique Chinese problem is the growing gender imbalance. So because of a traditional preference for boys, sex-selective abortion, and the one-child policy, China now has the world's largest surplus of males. At its peak, 120 boys were being born for every 100 girls. And right now, there are 20 million more men of marriage age than there are women of marriage age. That's growing by about 1 million a year, becoming much more dire by the minute. And of course, it's when these people get to marriage age when you really start to see the problems. So this is adding another layer to the pressure on a lot of young men, especially. Hard to find a good spouse anywhere in the world, but when there's a shortfall of 20 million women, then it's especially bad. And this, again, is disproportionately affecting the men at the bottom. But that's one of the obvious implications of this is a lot of dissatisfied men. But there are all kinds of weird side effects from this. Because so many men are desperate to find a wife, they see like having a house as something that will make them more attractive on the property market. So there's a mad dash for families with a male child to buy an apartment. Housing prices are just off the charts in China now. So real estate prices, they've done studies that link the gender imbalance. When it increases by a certain amount, real estate prices increase by a certain amount. Crime, single males murder at a rate 3 times higher than married adult males. There have been studies in China also linking this. For about every 1% increase there is in the gender imbalance, there's about a 4% increase in the crime rate. And you see this all over sex trafficking, prostitution, bride trafficking, sexual assault. And I covered this a little bit in rural areas for rural women, because this problem is most acute in rural areas where you still really have patriarchal attitudes. And this is really becoming tough on a lot of rural women, where marriage is kind of seen as a commodity in some ways, where family wants their daughter to marry the guy that's going to bring the biggest dowry, reverse dowry, I guess. So a lot of implications for young women, this gender imbalance. One of the more interesting implications of this, to get back to this idea of nationalism. So I talked at the beginning about how this patriotic education campaign since 1991 has really shifted the narrative in China against foreign powers. And I think the conventional wisdom, like the stereotype I told you, that Chinese youth have not pushed for any kind of lofty political things because of the materialism on one hand, but on the other hand, any angst they have is pretty effectively channeled towards foreign enemies like Japan, and to a lesser extent the West, the greater West, America, Europe. And the idea is that by focusing on foreign enemies, Chinese are less concerned with local leaders. But I think that the reality of that is quite a bit more complicated. So there's two guys I talk about in the book a lot that kind of illustrate the different extremes of what we think of as nationalism and how it's more complicated than we think. So this guy, Tsai Yang, he became famous in 2012 when there were these huge-scale anti-Japan protests across China, where there was a dispute over an island chain that both countries claim. And in Xi'an, during this big protest, a Chinese guy drove a Toyota through this protest, and this guy Tsai Yang dragged him out of the car, beat him on the head with a bicycle lock, left him partially paralyzed. And after that, he became kind of one of the most wanted of the protests. They put a lot of pictures of people who'd gotten violent, gotten out of control in these protests. And at first, like a couple media outlets, like a couple Japanese outlets, kind of portrayed it as, well, look at what the government's done. They've made young people hate Japan so much that they're willing to do this. But then some other media outlets got a bit deeper. They started looking at his microblogs, talking to his family and friends. And his background, he had really wanted to go to college. He was from a rural, very poor area in Shanxi province. He'd wanted to go to college. He failed the college entrance exam. So he was kind of relegated to doing migrant labor. He migrated to Xi'an. He was doing construction work, painting on construction sites. And people looked at his microblog and he wrote things like, please God, grant me a wife. So he was one of these bare branches that's probably not going to find a woman. And just all of his friends kind of gave a picture of somebody who was really at the bottom of society. Nobody paid him much attention. He escaped every day into video games to kind of go into this fantasy world. But then these anti-Japan protests started, and it kind of lit a spark into him, where he got swept up in it, kind of gave him a sense of significance, where he felt really important, and he just let uber patriotism get the best of him. And so I think this is where the idea of nationalism gets a little bit confused. Was it pure hatred of Japan that made him do this, or was it social alienation that kind of made him join up with this gang? And if you look at Chinese history, there's a lot of people like him. In the 19th century, China had a big gender imbalance also. During that time, there were a lot of floods and famine, and families, there was still this patriarchal culture where families had multiple children. They would selectively feed the boys, take care of the boys. So young girls started dying off, or in some cases being killed by their parents directly. China had this gender imbalance that was as high as, I think, 129 boys born for every 100 girls. And you had kind of these gangs of marauding males with nothing else to do but join up, and then they sort of coalesced in these larger rebellions. 19th century China was one of the most violent periods in the country's history. You had the Taiping Rebellion and the Yin Rebellion, the Boxer Rebellion, all these really domestic uprisings. Kind of a way one scholar put it is a gender imbalance doesn't create rebellion, but it provides kindling. If there's some kind of spark, it makes it easier to take off. And a lot of these rebellions were against the government. Some of them, like the Boxer Rebellion, aimed at foreign aggressors. Some aimed at more domestic sources. So when you talk about nationalism, I would really hesitate to conflate that with support for the ruling party, because quite often it's gone in the other direction, and it's a powerful thing to tinker with when you're in the government. And one way I've heard it put is the government kind of has a dilemma. They have a fire extinguisher on one hand and a can of gas in the other, where it's useful to flame up nationalism sometime, but at the same time, they don't want it to get out of control, go in other directions. The other guy I portray is the exact opposite of Zayang. So this guy is a Tsinghua University graduate, co-founded Renren, the equivalent of Facebook in China. Very smart, charming guy, and in 2008 there was this uproar about riots in Tibet and how foreign media was portraying it. He thought foreign media portrayed it unfairly, so he started this website called Anti-CNN, and it was just really critical of foreign media. And you look at some of what was written on the site, very rabidly jingoistic in some cases. But he had created this, and I talked to him. I was really kind of expecting like crazy guy, but I talked to him. Really smart, really sophisticated. And he said, you know, the first question foreign reporters always ask me is, are you being paid by the government to do this? And he kind of laughed. He said, that's impossible. I love to criticize the government also. And indeed, he went on to say these very, very critical things of the Chinese government. So again, he was incensed by what he saw as unfair treatment from foreign countries. But at the same time, that didn't conflate with supporting domestic leaders. And again, if you look at 20th century China, you've seen all sorts of domestic, or what started as nationalistic anti-foreign movements, like the May 4th movement in 1919. And then what I think a lot of people forget, 1985, there were anti-Japan protests in China that slowly started conflating slogans against corrupt leaders that were thought to be selling out China to foreign powers. And gradually, the balance shifted away from foreign targets to domestic leaders that were keeping China weak. And eventually that spiraled into what became the Tiananmen movement. So again, conflating the idea of nationalism with support for the government, I think, is a very flawed premise. In many cases in history, it has led directly to cries against the government. So I think that this is one aspect that's becoming very interesting with young people. But I would also kind of push back against the idea that young people in China are more nationalistic in spite of this patriotic education campaign. So a couple of stats that I think bear this out. This was a pretty new survey done that found 37% of Chinese over 35 view the US favorably. There's a much higher proportion of Chinese under 35, 56% view the US favorably. So you would think if this patriotic campaign kind of criticizing the West had been super successful, you would see the opposites. But in fact, young people becoming more favorable to the US. And the same thing with Japan. Another survey asked people a question in this Diaoyu Island dispute, should military force be an option to deal with it? Regardless of who starts a skirmish, should we be able to use the military in these disputes? 42% of Chinese born before 1990 said yes, you should be able to use the military in this. Slightly lower number of post-90s Chinese thought that it was okay. So not a huge difference, but the implication is younger people in China are less inclined to go to war for this. So I think this idea of nationalism is very complicated. On one hand, yes, the same survey actually found, though, that post-90s were more likely to see territorial disputes in the modern context as an extension of this century of humiliation. So it seems it was effective in that regard, but less inclined to see foreign countries as pure enemies. I mean, foreign movies, American movies are very popular. Like I said, individualism is sprouting. A lot of cultures you see in the US spreading to China. So I think the younger generation tends to have kind of a more nuanced view of the West and Japan, countries like this. So we have to be careful talking about nationalism. And the last thing I'll get to, I think that's kind of interesting, this idea about what this all means. So the things I'm trying to hammer home on one hand, young people becoming more ambitious, having higher expectations, more willing to fight for them. On the other hand, social reality getting worse. And right now, a lot of the things I talked about, these big protest movements, the online campaigns, these have really kind of chilled under Xi Jinping over the last 2-3 years. He's really been quite effective at reining in kind of the rambunctious things that happen on the internet, these huge street protests. So a lot of people are wondering now, has all this youthful idealism and kind of political activism been stopped, pushing in the other direction? And I think in the medium term, yes, these things have obviously been tamped down. But there's one interesting case study. The feminist I talked about earlier, when she and the 4 others were arrested, this big kind of outpouring of support came for them. So you would think that that might scare other would-be activists, but instead you had about 20 other feminist supporters show up at the detention facility protesting on their behalf. They were arrested quickly, but then I think they realized that was an unsustainable approach, so they let those go. But then you saw online a lot of people talking about it. There was a petition that was circulated, all kinds of support for these young women. And then this group was going around taking pictures, each wearing a mask, depicting one of the detained feminists, taking pictures in different places. And I thought that this was really interesting. This kind of pretending your leg is a gun. This was popularized a couple of years ago by some dissidents like Ai Weiwei. It's just kind of an all-purpose symbol of dissent. It doesn't have a real clear meaning, but it's just kind of an all-purpose critical of the government symbol of dissent. And to see these feminists use that symbol, when I had talked to them a couple years earlier, they were very intent that we don't care about politics, we care about feminist issues. They didn't even like me using the word protest. They said we do performance arts to raise awareness of these feminist issues. They were quite adamant that they did not have any higher political aspirations. But I think by imprisoning these feminists, to see them have this symbol, a much kind of more sensitive political statement, is very telling. And I think a lot of people that were focused on feminist issues became more politically interested after this crackdown. And the more, like when I was in China a couple months ago, I'd never heard so many young people talking about VPNs and bypassing the censorship of the Great Firewall. Internet censorship is getting more and more intense. And I think actions like detaining activists that are more and more sympathetic, it's no longer like the Liu Xiaobo's that are pushing fundamental political reform, much more innocuous people. They're bringing a lot more people into contact with the more kind of coercive measures of the state and possibly creating more opposition in the long run. But we'll see how that plays out. So I jabbered on long enough. I'll wrap it up there and open up to 2 questions.